All right, everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Moshe Hoffman. He is a research scientist at MIT Media Lab and lecturer at Harvard's Department of Economics. He applies game theory, models of learning and evolution, and experimental methods to try to decipher the incentives that shape our social behavior, preferences, and ideologies. He also co-designed and teaches game theory and social behavior, which lays out a lot of the evidence and models behind this approach. So, Dr. Hoffman, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you.
Okay. So the first question I would like to ask you is, what is game theory, and what are some of the main differences that you would like to point to between game theory and other approaches to study human behavior?
Yeah, so game theory is just like a mathematical toolkit, and I guess though many approaches to understanding human behavior, but I just think of game theory as just like a tool that can help any approach, right? So it can be used in the standard economic way of thinking about things, where you look at how people consciously make decisions, optimizing trade-offs, and game theory can help you with that analysis, or it can help a biologist who's analyzing animal behavior and evolving traits. And game theory is just going to then be a tool whenever payoffs or incentives come into play, and when those payoffs or incentives depend on interacting agents. So that will happen with firms bidding on radio wave spectrum, or it'll happen with animals fighting over territory. And in my case, as someone interested in human social behavior, it happens. Payoffs and incentives, influence. I'll argue, and maybe this is something we'll go into more, shape a lot of our ideologies, our preferences, our beliefs. And game theory comes into play then just as a mathematical tool that's useful for those kind of settings, because the payoffs and incentives in those settings are social and interactive. So just a tool, but of course you need a lens to know how to apply that tool. And in animal behavior, that lens is evolution of biology, and in firms, bidding on radio spectrum, that could be auction theory or IO or something like that. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so since you just told us that you're very interested in understanding a bit better how human social behavior works, do you in game theory also take into account certain things that go around in our mind, certain cognitive aspects that we've learned through disciplines like, for example, social psychology, like our biases and heuristics and things that we tend to pay attention to, and the ways our decision-making processes work? When do you use that then to perhaps predict through iterative interactions between people in a group how those interactions will develop and evolve over time? Is that it or not?
I guess, and tell me if I'm misunderstanding your question. The way that I think about social psychology and the phenomena that are documented in that field or related fields like JDM, judgment and decision making, is that those fields document really interesting phenomena. Phenomena like the heuristics that we use, that I don't know, Kahneman and Tversky might talk a lot about, or many other people in JDM, or other phenomena like cognitive dissonance or motivated realism or things like this, motivated reasoning, that social psychologists have done a really good job documenting. So I'll kind of take those things as given and look at all the features that they might have. And then I would try to do something that's kind of one step further, which is an analog that I guess many evolutionary psychologists would be familiar with. Is I would ask, okay, why does our brains work like this, or why do our beliefs work like this, or why do we use this heuristic, or why is this feature something that would have been selected for? And so, I very much appreciate those disciplines and what they've had to offer, but I, like other people in the evolutionary psych tradition, like to go a step further and ask why.
Okay, so we can use game theory. It has an explanatory power in regards to human behavior, right? I mean, we can use it also to find out what are some of the main strategies of social interaction that humans and also other animals, but since we're focusing here on humans, that they have evolved, correct?
Yeah, but again, I guess game theory, I like to think of it as like a tool, and then like how you apply it depends on like what setting and what set of assumptions you have in mind. If you're applying it to firms, choosing how to bid for radio wave, then you're gonna have to think about like conscious optimization and like what motive would they have to like bid optimally, like what kind of constraints do they have on like the ability to calculate like are there principal agent problems or things like that. But I usually apply game theory in the realm of human social behavior to understand things like these biases that social psychologists or JDM people have talked about, and then you might ask, why is game theory relevant to those settings? And I think that requires a little bit of thought, and maybe something you and I can discuss more or debate even. But I think of it as learning or evolutionary processes that shape our minds. And then if they shape our minds in a way that kind of is reflective of the incentive structure, perhaps because incentives in biological evolutionary contexts correspond to fitness, or in learning problems might correspond to like primary rewards or things like that, then game theory is going to come into play if you want to better understand those learning or evolutionary processes. And so for many of the biases that people in JDM or social psych have documented, those are biases that I think were shaped by some kind of combination of biological evolution and cultural evolution or learning processes like reinforcement learning. But in those cases, if these different processes are shaping our minds to create those biases, I would use game theory as a mathematical tool to help disentangle what are the different incentives at play, and to help disentangle what could have led learning processes or evolutionary processes to lead to these features of these particular biases. So game theory in a way is kind of like a tool that I use to go from these puzzling features to the learning or evolutionary processes, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense. And would you say that game theory, in comparison with other behavioral sciences, what it does is that it really gives us a mathematical model of how people interact? Because I mean, I guess that in other sciences, and we've already talked here about the biases and heuristics that people in social psychology and cognitive psychology discovered. But I guess that in those areas, they don't tend to present things in terms of mathematical models, but simply say, oh, we've discovered that people have this or that innate bias or something like that. And I mean, they don't really focus too much on studying the social dynamics over time and mathematically modeling it.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I do think it's a useful mathematical tool, but I guess I just want to also emphasize, and I think you're forcing me to articulate this, that like it's just one of several mathematical tools for helping us understand the way our minds work. I don't think it's the only one, and I don't think by itself it's like fully explanatory. I think it's a valuable one that's understudied in the social sciences, at least when thinking about where the biases of our mind come from. I think it's usually used to model firms and optimizing agents who are rational and conscious and calculating, and also somewhat used in biology to understand animal behavior. A little bit less have the models been developed to understand quirks of social cognition and things like motivated reasoning. And so obviously there's some work on that, but that's why I think the tools have been particularly underutilized and are particularly in need of further development. But I don't think it's the only tool to understand, the mind. And I think it's a tool only in complement with other tools. It just happens to be the one that I specialized in. So, many people, other mathematical tools that might be relevant are very, very nice, of which I'm only partly familiar at a very low level, nice models of like reinforcement learning. there's a lot of interesting mathematics of like, how one would model either the way animals or humans or an ideal robot or AI would learn. And those kind of models also involve interesting mathematics and could potentially teach us a lot about human agents. I happen to not specialize so much in those models, but I think they're potentially a very valuable contribution to also understanding human social cognition. But those are just two: game theory, reinforcement learning. Joe Henrich, Rob Boyd, these people kind of develop models of cultural evolutionary processes and social learning, and I think that's also potentially a very, very valuable toolkit. And then many others, but those are three that I myself know a little bit about and have looked into. But they all kind of require a little bit, not just the mathematical tools, but also the lens. So you kind of need to think about, why would these models be relevant? How do you interpret them in these contexts? Because you can't just, take game theory from an econ textbook and then immediately understand, social cognition, because the econ textbooks aren't written to understand social cognition, and there's a lot of kind of interpretation that needs to go on with it, and of course that's going to complement other fields that other people have developed, like evolutionary psychology. You kind of need to be able to think about, like, the mind obviously isn't a tabula rasa. So what counts as an incentive is going to be something that evolved, and that requires understanding of evolutionary psychology, or maybe cultural evolution, or reinforcement learning, or other toolkits and ways of thinking in order to bring the game theory in and make it sensible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting that you just referred again to evolutionary psychology, because I would like to ask you. So, from an evolutionary perspective, we know that the strategies of interaction that people use in society depend a lot on the incentives that underlie them, and these incentives are influenced, I guess, by our innate proclivities, innate preferences, and the information we collect from our environment, and how our innate cognition processes it, in this case regarding the social realm, let's say. But there's inter-individual variation, that is variation among individuals in terms of the strategies that each one of them prefers, and perhaps in a given society one of them is more prevalent, and in another society there's another strategy different than the first one that is more prevalent. So does game theory also help us to predict? So if we have a certain percentage of individuals following a certain strategy, and another percentage following the opposite strategy, let's say, does it help us predict perhaps how that society will evolve over time, in terms of if one of the strategies will prevail, and if 100% of the individuals will start following it, or the opposite, and things like that?
I think it's a tool that offers some insight on that. It's mostly not optimized for, like, understanding dynamic processes and long-term trends. I think we can get into discussions of what other models might be useful for that. What game theory I find is most useful for is knowing what maybe two ways to put this. One is like it's equilibrium concepts, which is all about saying, if the population is stable at something, what features need that behavior have? And so it's mostly designed to understand kind of stable populations. And now it might tell you, like, if a population is stable, and if everybody kind of does things a certain way, then certain features need to hold, or certain constraints need to be satisfied.
By the way, could you just tell us what is a stable society? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so obviously stable is just a made-up mental idea that doesn't actually exist, like the triangle or the perfect sphere or whatever, like it's a platonic solid that's not actually real. But the idea is that if, like, so maybe it's worth giving the definition of Nash equilibrium. So Nash is just like a description of how everybody would behave, such that nobody could individually benefit by deviating if everybody else stays the same. So if everybody does what you expect, would you benefit by doing something that's not expected? And so Nash says, if nobody would benefit from unilaterally deviating, then that's an equilibrium. And so what does it mean for that to be an equilibrium? That means that if everybody expects it, then nobody's going to do anything different, which also means that if somebody tries to do something different, they would actually get lower payoffs than they anticipated. So a reinforcement learning process would tell them, oh, that didn't work out, go back to what you were doing before. A social learning process would say, don't imitate that guy because he got lower payoffs. Or a biologically evolving process would say, oh, that mutant will have less offspring and die out. So the population, according to all three of those dynamics, will then go back to the Nash equilibrium. And so that's the basic premise of Nash equilibrium, is that if you start at a population of Nash equilibrium, either because of conscious reasoning or biological evolution, cultural evolution, reinforcement learning, you'll stay there. And so in some sense, it's a description of how everybody behaves such that it's stable according to one of these processes. And so that's kind of the valuable explanatory power that it has, is it tells you what kinds of things can be stable according to these processes. And so then as a scientific tool, it's useful because then if you see people doing something pretty much, in a stable way, and again, that's a Platonic solid thing that doesn't exist, but maybe in a scientific world that would mean oh, you kind of see this consistently over the long term, you kind of see everybody doing it, you kind of see it fairly uniformly. If you see something that looks like a real feature of society or social behavior or the way people think that's consistent, then okay, that has to be stable according to these processes. And so then okay, then it must be if you think these processes we can argue, but then I would interpret that as, okay, it must mean that things are Nash, and so now we can figure out what are the incentives that could be sustaining this. And so maybe Nash can give us some insights as to what kind of incentives might be at play. So an example of this might be okay, motivated reasoning, is something that we see. It looks, I don't know, I guess we'd have to check, but it looks like it's not just a modern invention of weird society. It looks like it's maybe a very somewhat by culture, but I think of it as probably a human universal that was probably around in our culture for as far back as we look. And so that tells me, okay, it's probably something that's kind of stable according to these processes. And so then you kind of have to ask, okay, what are the incentives that could be driving it? So that's one example of that. Another might be we treat omission different from commission, in our moral intuitions. So why would we consistently treat omission as less bad than commission? We seem to do that cross-culturally. We seem to do that, if you look back historically, I do that today. I'll probably do it in 10 years from now. So it's a kind of a stable trait of human cognition that omissions feel less bad than commission. Okay, then that must mean that it perhaps, if these dynamic processes are at play, then it must be at some sort of equilibrium. And so then I might then ask, okay, well then what could be sustaining this as an equilibrium? And so then I might use some game theory tools to reverse engineer what could be the incentives that shape omissions to be different from commission. So that's an example. Maybe hopefully that clarifies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to repeat the question. I was just asking you, so we have these several different types of strategies in game theory, like for example, tit for tat, walk away, and those types of strategies. When you say that, for example, the individuals in a certain group or society tend to follow the tit for tat strategy, are you pointing toward the fact that they have several different innate strategies, and when they are exposed to a certain social environment, subconsciously they choose and prefer that type of strategy, or that is something that is completely built up by the environment itself, and it's not really that all individuals have these have all of these strategies that they can follow, but perhaps it is the environment itself that creates them.
I see. Yeah. So let me see if I can unpack your question a little bit. So one way to interpret your question is like, is it that our strategies are innate and genetically encoded, or are they culturally learned? And I think in some contexts, or learned by like reinforcement learning, and I think in some contexts it's going to be each. Some contexts it might even be consciously something that you figure it out. So I think those are different processes that could lead to the selection of your strategy. And I think we'd have to talk about, from example to example, which one's the most, which process is the one that's most likely to be at play. But I guess even when it's like socially learned or learned through reinforcement learning, there's going to obviously be some constraint in like the search space. So we're not going to be trying every single strategy. Obviously our learning processes are somewhat limited in what kinds of things they would think to try or think to imitate. So there'll be some goal of like biological evolution in constraining the search. But it turns out that like learning processes are also pretty good at rapidly searching very vast spaces, and are pretty good at collecting a lot of information very efficiently, and so in that sense, a lot of strategies I do think are kind of invented fairly de novo, and again, how de novo will depend on the application.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but even the new strategies that people might create in new environments, let's say perhaps environments that we didn't really have access to during most of our evolutionary history, those are still biologically constrained? Is that what you're saying?
I guess more or less. I think we're pretty good. So I don't think that like every strategy is like picked from a set that was pre-selected by biological evolution, right? So it's not like we either play hawk or dove, and those are the only two, and biology said play hawk in this environment and play dove in this environment. I think that that's true for some contexts. So like I don't know what for most humans, not all obviously, but for most humans, we have something that kicks in that says be attracted to males if you have two X chromosomes, and be attracted to females if you have if you have an X and a Y, and like that's something that gets turned on from testosterone, in prenatal or later stages in life, or when you develop during puberty and so on, and so that's something that there are. I mean, it's obviously a lot richer than this, but there's basically two different strategies in the sense that you could either more or less, or at least there's a big difference between how males and how females are gonna work for the most part, and that's fairly well encoded in that there's been a lot of like genetic evolution to shape like the different mentalities of males and females, but obviously. So like for some things like that, you can code in this like, okay, if you have an X chromosome, act this way. If you have a Y chromosome, act that way. But like not everything is as easy to pre-encode. So like whether or not like you let's say are attracted to long fingernails as an example that I give in class. So that's something that like seems to show up in like some parts of Asia, Northeast India is where I observed it, where this fingernail and this fingernail are extra long, and people find that beautiful there. And that's not something that like there's a switch in our head that says either be attracted to long fingernails or short fingernails, in the same way that there might be a switch in our head that says be attracted to males or be attracted to females. That's not like there's no such switch. We had to like, kind of de novo culturally evolve this like this sense of beauty, that like a long fingernail is something that is beautiful, and so in that sense it's different from the male-female switch, and it's kind of created more de novo, if that makes any sense. Obviously everything has a mix, and it's a continuum. Even like male-female, whether you're attracted to male-female, there's a huge variation in what kind of person you're attracted to, and so on. But I think you get my point.
Yeah. So, for example, when we read the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and at a certain point there he talks about the experiments that people like Robert Axelrod and others did by doing computer simulations and mathematical modeling, that they arrived at the conclusion that tit for tat was the most evolutionarily stable strategy. What does that really mean there?
Well, I think there they were trying to argue that this idea of in repeated games you can sustain cooperation via something like reciprocity, and we could use a game theory model and a computer simulation of an evolutionary process in that model, that you could get some notion of reciprocity to evolve, and that could explain some aspects of altruism. I think that's right, and that's a very nice insight, and I'm happy to unpack it more for you if you want. I think it's a pretty good use of game theory to kind of better understand how altruism could evolve and what feature it would need to have, like some notion of reciprocity, some notion of there's a future and you'll be penalized in the future for misbehaving today, or rewarded in the future for behaving well today. So I think it's a useful method to understand how altruism works and how it might evolve. And I think that's quite consistent with the way that I use game theory and think about game theory. There's a few differences. Some obviously that study was done, I don't know, in the 70s or something, so 40, 50 years ago. So obviously I think science has advanced since then, and I can tell you things that I thought were wrong with that experiment, or things that I think we've learned since, or that I disagree with. But I think it was a great contribution to science, and I think it's fundamentally the right way to think about, the evolution of cooperation and the elements of game theory to understand social cognition.
Yes, but in that case, when Robert Axelrod says, for example, that tit-for-tat strategy through the computer simulations that he did was the one that was more stable over time, that doesn't really mean that. I mean, over time, the individuals that were part of that specific population, let's say, that some of them didn't try to use other strategies, but perhaps those types of strategies didn't really disseminate successfully throughout the population, right?
Yeah, that's good. So I think that's right. I'm sorry to clarify that, but yeah, in their simulations, they kind of had people. I think in the version of the experiment you're describing, they had people contribute different strategies, and then they had them kind of play around robin with each other, and then the strategies would reproduce based on the payoffs they got against each other, and then in the computer simulation they'd either become more frequent or die off, and so tit for tat was the thing that became most frequent as all the other ones died off. And so I think that's right. That's kind of like a model of how evolution might work. Is like you have a population that's seeded with a bunch of strategies. In reality, they're probably not all seeded at once. You kind of have some randomly showing up every now and again, but they were obviously doing a simplified model. When a strategy doesn't do well against the rest of the population, it'll become less and less frequent and die off. And when a strategy does well, it'll become more and more frequent. And so that's kind of what they were simulating in their experiment. To try and get at the insight that tit for tat is a strategy that does well against other strategies and against itself, and you can kind of get a stable population of tit for tat agents, and more generally, you can kind of get a stable population of agents that are reciprocating and cooperative, and that an essential feature of such cooperation for it to be stable needs this kind of shadow of the future and so on.
Okay, so from a biological perspective, is it also true that game theory can also allow for us to predict? So if we are dealing with a certain animal, like for example humans, and we know in which context, in this case the social context, it is evolving, does it allow us to predict based on that the kinds of strategies that would be favored the most, even in terms of genetic transmission of the predisposition to those sorts of strategies? If I'm being clear here, of course.
No, you are being clear. I think it's an interesting question. I tend to use game theory differently, and I tend to think about it as a science in kind of the reverse way. So let me try and explain the distinction, because I think what you're saying is a perfectly reasonable way to think about it. But I think it works less well when you try that way. So let me try and clarify the distinction. And I think it's kind of analogous to how Darwin or some early evolutionary thinkers might think about biology, which is that it's these tools, the game theory tools that I'm using, or evolutionary theory that Darwin was thinking in, or early biologists were thinking in, is really useful, in my opinion, for explaining things that we already see better than predicting things that we haven't yet seen. And so, in the same sense that I don't think Darwin would have been able to predict, you would get this species there, or in 10,000 years we're going to have a species that looks like this. I think the tools just aren't great for that. In other fields, you do have tools that are really good at predicting the future, or engineering, or designing, or changing the future. I kind of think of the theory of evolution, as well as the stuff that I do, as more good at understanding the things that we observe than at prediction. So more explanatory tools. So if we see something, I can try and reverse engineer what's going on and tell you, these might be incentives that are at play, or this kind of game might be what's driving these kind of features. But with that said, there is still some predictive power, just as I think Darwin had, which is, largely things like comparative statics, which is a term that economists use, which just means qualitative predictions, which means that you're not going to be able to predict to the T what's going to happen, but you're going to be able to say on an island with smaller seeds, you're going to have beaks that are thinner, which is the kind of prediction that Darwin was able to make. And I think that's what the theory of evolution is good at. I think the same thing with the way that I'm using game theory. It can make these kind of directional qualitative predictions, which is to say that in contexts where norm enforcement is less relevant and partner choice is more relevant, the omission-commission distinction should be less pronounced. So that's kind of a qualitative prediction. I'm not going to be able to say this is exactly what morality would be shaped like in this society. It's more of in this context we'd see morality being slightly more pronounced in this dimension and slightly less in this dimension. So again, just qualitative predictions like the beak length and seed size predictions that Darwin had.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but perhaps in trying to predict some general features of our behavior, for example, trying to predict that our species, since we are individuals that from a strictly biological point of view, we weren't really very good predators, at least individually. We don't have claws, we don't have good teeth to catch other animals, and we're not really that strong in comparison with other animals. With that in mind, and knowing that in order for us to be evolutionarily successful as groups of humans, wouldn't game theory predict that we would have to evolve, at least to a certain point, some sort of altruistic behavior or something like that?
Yeah. I think it's true that in human evolution, cooperation was kind of fundamental, and I think norm enforcement likely is a particularly powerful tool that Rob Boyd talks a lot about, I guess the second chapter of his recent book has a lot of evidence for throughout human history and across cultures and stuff, how much it's impossible for us to do anything without strong norms and norm enforcement, and I think that's very true. And I think that game theory is a valuable tool if you want to understand how norms get enforced. And I agree with you that cooperation, which I think an important way cooperation happens is because of norm enforcement, is kind of integral for human society to function.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've been talking a lot about norm enforcement. Could you explain that term? And does it occur at both biological and the cultural level, or is it something strictly cultural?
Yeah. So here I'm going to largely talk, just Boyd's view. But if you want, I can add in where game theory, my particular game theory models have added to this. But for the most part, I think I'm just stealing from him, which is that and obviously not just him. I just recently read his book, but he's working with many colleagues. But I generally buy the story presented in that book, which is that norms. We have some kind of evolved psychology for norms that, like an evolved psychology of language, helps us acquire them, helps us to be prepared to imitate them or to spot them and things like that. Tells us what kind of features they're likely to have and so on. So it's not a blank slate view, but the content of norms seems to be very much culturally evolved. And very, very sensitive to the context of what norms get enforced and how much you enforce them and in which cases you enforce them and things like that. So the general psychology of being able to enforce norms seems biologically evolved, but the content seems very much culturally evolved. And then maybe just to relate it back to an earlier question you asked about tit for tat. I kind of think, and I kind of hinted at this, that there's a few things that I think were missing in that original story by Dawkins, which again, I very much, and Axelrod and those people that he cites, very much a valuable story. There's a few pieces that are missing. One is that, in that story, there isn't that much variation in content, right? You either choose to cooperate or defect. It's a very simple choice in each stage. And then tit for tat is a very simple strategy, which is you cooperate against someone if they cooperated against you in the past. And the game is very simple. And there isn't much room for cultural variation in content there. And so that's one reason why it's while a great starting point, it isn't rich enough to understand, to help us grasp, why we get penalized for littering. Right? There's clearly somewhat of a disconnect between that stylized model and a model that allows for more rich content. Which isn't to say it's a bad starting point. It was obviously very good. There's no way we would understand what we do now without that simple stylized game. But it's missing this kind of rich content. Another thing that's missing is it's two-player. It's dyadic. And so I choose whether to cooperate or defect. You choose whether to cooperate or defect. The two of us repeat. But in society, you're usually not just interacting with one other person. When I littered in high school, some guy pulled up his truck in front of me. I'd never met him before in my life. I'll never meet him again. And he told me to pick up the litter. That wasn't a dyadic interaction. I don't really think his behavior is like a spillover from evolved psychology of a dyadic interaction. I think you really need a richer model to capture that. And I think that requires some kind of model of norm enforcement that is slightly richer than the tit for tat. Repeated prisoner's dilemma, but similar game theory tools and similar insights are going to come into play if you want to model norm enforcement, like the shadow of the future and some notion of conditional behavior, where how I get treated tomorrow depends on how I behave today. So some insights will carry over, but it's going to be I don't know if that did that address what you asked me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I would like to pick up on that last part, because pitting biological aspects against cultural aspects of our behavior and our nature. I would like now to establish a bridge with a recent thread you made on Twitter. I think it was in December, about evolutionary psychology and some of the problems that you point that it has, at least. So at the very beginning of the thread you say, and now I'm going to cite, in particular, EP is one of the few fields in the social sciences that attempts a sound and unifying approach that is tremendously valuable and desperately needed in the social sciences. So just before we get into the criticisms, and then perhaps we can pick up on some good examples also to explore a little bit more game theory, what would you say are some of the strongest parts of the evolutionary psychological method? let's
Yeah,
say.
I think I wanted to say I think that you just said it well, but you were quoting me, so I guess I'm complimenting my past self. I like what I said in that tweet before I criticized evolutionary psych. I think I summarized what they're doing well, which is it's a theoretically sound approach that is that is unifying. And I think any good science needs to have that, and that's desperately needed for human psychology and social behavior, sociology, anthropology, and stuff. I think the social sciences desperately needs a unifying approach. And I think evolutionary psychology, as it was built by Tubi and Cosmides and people like that, you know, a generation or so ago, did offer that. And for many parts of human psychology, I think it succeeded very well at that. So I think our understanding of mating, for instance, or attraction and sex differences, these kind of topics, I think it's really impossible to understand without evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology obviously misses some details on it, but I mean, you know, Darwin missed some details on how biology works. But I think fundamentally it's the right approach to give a unifying understanding of these domains. And it's theoretically sound. It's exactly, you know, our minds seem to have biologically evolved for attraction and mating and sex differences and stuff. And so it seems, and you know, the way they're thinking about mental modules and things like that seems to really fit there. So theoretically sound, unifying, I think it's extremely valuable there. I don't know if you wanted me to jump in on where I think it's missing yet, but maybe you were about to ask.
Yeah, I'm about to ask you about that. So the first criticism that you point toward, I guess, is that at a certain point you say that the approach that evolutionary psychology has to human behavior, that it is best understood through pre-adaptations, that is, evolved responses to environmental cues based on ancestral experience and selection. So what do you mean there by pre-adaptations? And I'm asking you this because I've already had a lot of evolutionary psychologists on the show, and for me at least, it isn't really clear what you meant by this term there.
Yeah, I agree. So maybe we need to develop a new term. I kind of just like invented that in the thread, and it's not obvious to me how to word this. So maybe you'll help me with that. But it relates back to like some questions that you asked me earlier in this conversation, and maybe you're already kind of thinking about trying to see this difference. But you know, when I was talking about fingernails versus like male-female sex differences, that like you know. So some things in biology are coded that like just everyone always does the same thing. Like we all breathe. Like as soon as we come out of the womb, like parts of our bodies are just structured so that we start breathing. And there's no variation in that. There's no like, that's just something that we clearly evolved to breathe. But some things are very like, require a switch, and that only sometimes some of us do it. So like being attracted to females is something that most males do, but most females don't do. And so there's a switch, maybe it's not as 0-1 as I'm describing, but there's a switch of sorts that tells our brain, oh, be attracted to females, oh, be attracted to males. And that switch, so it's not the being attracted to males that's something that's like universally human trait, but the switch, the being able to either be attracted to males or females, seems to have been something that was genetically coded for. And in fact, whether the switch gets turned on or off seems to depend on something like prenatal androgens, or maybe androgens during puberty. So there's a switch, what sex you're attracted to, and then there's like certain features of the environment that turn it off or on, like androgens at different stages in development. And all those things were kind of pre-adapted in the sense that like biological evolution in our ancestral history had to deal with the fact that sometimes our genes showed up in males and sometimes they showed up in females, and they needed to act differently in those two cases. And so you know, the genes you know figured out through biological evolution a way to kind of code in, oh, behave differently, be attracted to a different type if you're in a different body. You know, namely, if you have male genitalia, for the most part, you know, be attracted to females. And so, you know, detect whether you're male genitalia, maybe by the presence of testosterone, and behave differently. And so that kind of that switch is something that we had in evolutionary history dealing with this problem, namely that we sometimes show up in males and sometimes females, and we dealt with it by having a switch that says, okay, be attracted to males if you have testosterone exposure. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the basic idea. There's a switch that we encoded because our genetic history had to deal with this problem that sometimes our genes show up in both males and females. Okay, so other switches that might happen is, I don't know, maybe you're born in an environment with a lot of resources or little resources. So life history theory talks about, like, in those two different cases, there might be different optimal strategies. If you're in an environment with a lot of resources, maybe you don't need to stress out as much. You can plan to live a long life. Have good, be very careful what you do. There's no need to take extra risks, things like that. So different optimized strategies for an environment with either high or low resources. That's something we could then evolve a switch that says, oh, if you're in an environment with a lot of resources, turn on this set of features, like be more cautious and less stressed. And plan to live a long life. Whereas with a few resources, okay, a new switch turns on that says, okay, be very, take a lot of risks, do whatever you can to, amass resources quickly. Okay, so that's a pre-adaptation in the sense that our evolutionary history had to deal with both environments with a lot and a little resources, and so had to kind of adapt to have a switch that tells us behave differently in these two different cases. Okay, but I think that there are many instances where we seem very well adapted, but not in this sense that, in our evolutionary history, we had to deal with this problem. Rather, we have a learning module that says, okay, figure out how to deal with problems. So an example that I mentioned earlier is long fingernails. I don't think that, in our evolutionary history, we were sometimes in environments where people thought long fingernails were beautiful, and sometimes in environments where people didn't think they were beautiful. And there's a switch in my brain that says, check if people like long fingernails. If they do, grow them. I don't think such a switch exists. Instead, what I think happens is, there's some kind of, social imitation process going on where we have a general learning module that says, get your sense of beauty from other people. Do things that people find beautiful if you can. And that generalized notion of beauty kind of then socially gets learned and culturally evolves. And so then, the ability to socially learn it is a biological adaptation, but the content of it, namely whether or not you like long fingernails, is not something that's a biological adaptation. That's culturally, that content is culturally learned. And by pre-adapted, I just meant it's not like we had a previous environment where we faced this exact problem of long fingernails being beautiful. So hopefully that example clarifies. And if you have a better term than pre-adaptation, I'm happy to take it.
Okay, but just to try to make this clearer for people who will be watching or listening to this later, so would you, for example, call an adaptation something like, I don't know, in terms of beauty, evolutionary psychologists refer a lot to, in women, how men like women with neotenous facial characteristics, or a waist to hip ratio of 0.7, or clear skin, large breasts, and things like that. So those types of things, since we were constantly exposed to that during our evolutionary history, that for you would be a proper adaptation. But but things like, for example, as you said, longer fingernails, I mean, since at least as far as we know, we weren't really directly exposed to that during our evolutionary history and during the Pleistocene and things like that, in our environments of adaptation. I can't remember now the proper term, but it's something like that. That is the environments we evolved and are adapted to from an evolutionary perspective, that all of the things that we nowadays consider beautiful in different societies that were not really part of that ancestral environment, if evolutionary psychologists try to explain them on the same basis, that would be something that you call a pre-adaptation. Is that correct?
I think that's right. And so all I was trying to do with that terminology was to differentiate between differentiate between things that are adaptive because of biological evolution, which requires, kind of by assumption, that it's a problem that we faced in our evolutionary past. And things that are adaptive, not because of any experience in our evolutionary past, but only because of some real-time learning process like social imitation or reinforcement learning. And so I was kind of trying to differentiate these two different ways in which you can get adaptations. I was calling pre-adaptation anything that is biologically evolved, because that requires that it was done in the past based on evolutionary past, as opposed to a contemporary adaptation that kind of just shows up and in real time we're able to figure out through whatever real time process. To contrast that maybe with many things that are kind of non-functional that we do. So maybe this is a third category: pre-adaptations, contemporary adaptations, and non-functional like spandrels. So I don't know, the fact that we're turned on by pornography or that we eat donuts. Those are things that they're based off of adaptations from the past, biological adaptations, that don't really fit well with our contemporary environment. So in our evolutionary past, nude women were things you could potentially reproduce with. Nowadays, you can generate them on computers. That's not something we experienced in our evolutionary past, and so there's a mismatch. And so our psychology of attraction is non-functional in this case. It's built off of an adaptation that doesn't currently fit. And so that's kind of a third class of, you can have pre-adaptations that no longer fit. And I think my main point that I was trying to state in that thread, and maybe just to reiterate here, is that oftentimes, evolutionary psychologists kind of think of it as like there's two options. You can either have biological adaptations or spandrels, mismatches. And I was trying to say, actually, you can have a lot of things that are quite adaptive, that are just adaptive due to real-time processes, like social imitation or reinforcement learning, and that could lead to adaptive behaviors that have nothing to do with that don't require pre-adaptations. Allow for kind of a third class. And I think that third class is of like tremendous relevance in many domains, not in all. So I think for like mating and sexual attraction, perhaps less. We seem to have like a psychology that's more, it's all relative, but more fixed and harder to shift. But with like our sense of morality and our sense of like our political ideologies and those kind of domains, I think contemporary real-time adaptations are much more important if you want to understand those. And I think that that's the real place in which evolutionary psychology has kind of missed a lot of insight, because they're too focused on either pre-adaptations or spandrels. They kind of missed out. There's a lot of stuff that can lead to contemporary real-time adaptations via these other processes, like in domains like morality and if you want to understand politics. So that was the main point I was trying to make. Hopefully it's clearer now, but let me know if you have follow-up questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in your thread you talk about several different areas. Let's say you talk about aesthetics, politics, morality, principles and passions, and you present these as examples of things that evolutionary psychology, as you say, cannot properly tackle or explain, at least only through the tools that evolutionary psychology has at its disposal, let's say. So, but let's just pick up on one of those examples. And since we were talking about beauty and the fingernails and those things, let's talk a little bit about aesthetics, because at a certain point in your thread, as far as I remember, you talk about how evolutionary psychology, with the tools that it has, couldn't really explain why people would develop a taste for ugly stuff or grotesque stuff. So could you please tell us a little bit about that, and then perhaps we will discuss it, for me, just to try to convince you that perhaps there's a bit more to the evolutionary psychological method.
Yeah, and I guess I should clarify, and it's possible, obviously, on Twitter or anytime, you're prone to misstate or overstate. So I shouldn't say evolutionary psychology has no insight on these domains. I kind of meant it more of a relative statement, which is that in these domains, there's a lot of open material that I'm more prone to seeing evolutionary psych either skirting or giving the wrong explanation for it. But I don't mean to say that evolutionary psych tools haven't offered any insight on these topics. I mostly mean it as like, in the broad scope of things, compared to like how well we understand mating or sexual attraction. Evolutionary psych seems to have nailed that perfectly. Here they seem to have had some insights, but missed a huge swath of stuff and actually given the wrong answer to other subsets. So again, relative claim, and I know that there is good evolutionary psych work in these domains, and happy if you want to point me to more that I'm not aware of. But I guess my main point on aesthetics is that a lot of aesthetics does seem to be about things like what Steven Pinker talks about and what you talked about 15 or so minutes ago, which is just that some things are innately pleasing, like voluptuous woman or serene landscapes. Probably there's an evolved psychology that just makes us attracted to those things or feel pleasure when looking at such things. And I think, Steve Pinker, explains this quite well as like visual cheesecake. It's just kind of like, cheesecake is something that we evolved to like sweet things, and manufacturers have figured out ways to like, pump in as much sweetness and fat as you can into cheesecake. The same with some of these painters, especially in like the Renaissance and these kind of periods, found out ways to like make paintings look really, really real and very, very pretty, and sometimes even exaggeratedly so. So you can make women more curvy than is actually possible in real life, and that would be even more stimulating in this visual cheesecake sense. And I think there's good work to show that a lot of art, in fact, does this. And so I think that part of art is very well understood by this visual cheesecake story that Pinker describes. And then I think there are other insights in aesthetics that evolutionary psychologists talked about. I didn't mention it in my thread, but George, is it Miller? Am I getting his name right? I think that's, well, anyhow, there's a prominent evolutionary psychologist who wrote The Mating Mind, Geoffrey Miller.
Oh, Geoffrey Miller, yeah.
Sorry. He was right to point out that I left his work off that thread. So let me reiterate his insight, which I think is quite pertinent, which is just that a lot of art is about men showing off their abilities. Our creativity or spatial abilities or things like that. And I think that's very right too, and that captures an essential feature of what art does. And I think it's very clear why we would evolve a psychology where we would look for males who are especially talented or try to show off our such talents. And I think that's an important part of what goes on in aesthetics too, and he's right to point that out. I guess my main point was, while these are two essential features, and I'm sure there's more to evolutionary psych than that, and hopefully you'll bring up some others that I missed out, these two prominent insights in evolutionary psych seem to miss some crucial parts of what goes on in aesthetics. That I think you really need to think of contemporary incentives to grasp. And which isn't to say they'll be totally independent of what Geoffrey talks about or totally independent from other insights from evolutionary psych. Obviously, whatever contemporary incentives and cultural evolutionary or other learning processes go on have to go on top of our evolved minds. So what they said is right, but it's missing stuff. That's my claim. So what are some of the things that they might be missing in art? Well, for instance, a lot of modern art happens to be involved, I think, and we can analyze a lot of what's going on. But one thing that seems to be going on a lot is you add arbitrary constraints. So like you have to do things by like cutting them up into pieces and putting the pieces in random angles in your image. Okay, so why random angles and cutting it up into pieces? We can talk about like what that might add, but one of the things that seems to add is it makes it much harder to figure out what's going on. And it makes it much harder to make a compelling image that's like evocative. But yet, people really like cubism. And Either, I don't know, you can try to paint without a brush. You can paint by just dripping paint. So that seems to be a constraint. The constraint might add some benefits, like now you get to learn more about like what the person was doing with their arm while they were painting, which is maybe easier to control with a brush. Now you get maybe a deeper sense of what they're feeling, maybe. But it seems to be like an arbitrary constraint, which might highlight some features, but definitely make other things harder. Like it's harder to like draw an image this way, and it's harder to express to convey an idea as error-free, or I don't know, but it seems to do something by adding this constraint. And it's not obvious to me like why art would have these kind of arbitrary constraints in them, according to Steve Pinker's story. I think Jeffrey would say, well, maybe adding these constraints allows you to show off creativity in a new way, and I think that's right. But that still, isn't going to tell us so much about like where these constraints came from, how they got the meanings they did, and things like that. And I think like his story is essentially right, but you kind of need to look more into like the contemporary incentives to understand more of what's going on. And I think just thinking about men showing off on their own, I think is only going to get you the starting point. And I think you need to do more to understand modern art. You need to do more to understand some of these other features.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that Geoffrey Miller really has very good insights into as to why art and artistic behavior might have evolved, but I think that there are two issues here. So on the one hand, I think I'm compelled to agree with you when you say that, for example, we couldn't really explain through strictly evolutionary psychological principles how something like cubism might have evolved culturally, let's say. But on the other hand, and since you're talking about incentives, I think that there are other aspects that we can add to it. So for example, let's say that, for example, cubism was invented, or any other type of art, related to painting in this case, and it got associated with the elites, that people from the social elite would prefer those types of things just to, in an initial phase, distinguish themselves from the other people below them in the social hierarchy, let's say. So if we have that, then I think we can really use evolved principles, and not only from evolutionary psychology, but also from other disciplines like people who study cultural evolution, but always with our innate evolved biases, heuristics and stuff like that. And I've already talked with Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson on the show. So for example, if you had an elite that really liked that type of art, then you would have perhaps the prestige bias operating there, and people would start to looking more and more at those types of things because they started to be associated with social status. And then perhaps if over time it trickled down the social hierarchy, then it would spread among people as a preference, as an aesthetic preference, and perhaps people would also then activate the conformity bias and other things like that. And what I mean by this is that through several different innate cognitive aspects that we have that are innate and evolved, and so we can explain them through evolutionary theory applied to human psychology, then with that we would be able to explain why something that really breaks drastically with our innate evolved preferences in terms of beauty and aesthetics would then spread through a population, and people perhaps wouldn't like it because of its intrinsic properties, but due to something that was perhaps extrinsic to the piece of art, but could be explained as well by evolutionary psychology and other disciplines like that.
Yeah, yeah. I think I see what you're saying, and I think like what I would only say is that there seem to be features that you need in addition to the evolutionary psych story to understand what's going on, and without those features, you're likely to misunderstand what's going on. But I guess I should mention that in this conversation, it's clear to me that I should think a little bit more carefully about the relation to Jeffrey Miller's story. But you know, let me try to mention a few distinctions or a few things that. Okay, so one that comes to mind is, and maybe he does have a good argument against this, is that it's not so obvious why we find the piece itself beautiful if it has signs that some of the things that make the piece beautiful are going to be that the artist is more talented. So maybe we like it more because it shows more creativity. But some of the things also seem to not relate to that. Again, I think he's capturing a crucial insight here, but I think there's some parts not captured by it. So let me see if I can articulate a few that are not. So one might be that if the piece conveys a political ideal that we want to show off, then I might say I really like this piece. And that could be true whether or not it shows something about the artist who created it. Okay. Another thing that might show off, that might increase our liking of the piece that has nothing to do with the talent of the artist, is if it particularly is good at allowing us to show off our own creativity at deciphering the piece. So one thing about Picasso is that if you look at it, it's kind of hard to figure out what's going on, but I don't know, if you took an art history class, you might be able to figure out that that's his dealer holding a flask. And if you could tell that to the person you're next to, well, that can show off something about your own knowledge of art history. And that might be one reason why people like Picasso, is because it allows me to show off my insider knowledge or ability to like solve this puzzle. And so I think that that's, again, not to denigrate Jeffrey's story, because I think that solves many of the puzzles of art. I just think that there are some other puzzles of art that require looking at some other aspects of the incentive structure. And my guess is he wouldn't disagree with that he'd say he's explaining some but not all. And so I think that there's probably a richness of many incentives at play, one of which is showing off the talent of the artist, another is showing off your own values or your own ability to, your own insider knowledge and ability to like decipher what's going on in the piece. And those are three of, I don't know, probably 20 incentives at play. Some of these incentives are going to be ones that are evolutionarily ancient, like men wanting to show off. But some might not be, how do you show off in this particular novel way that hasn't been dealt with in the past, like knowledge of art history. And it's probably going to be, a mixture of these things, some of which, well, anyhow, I hopefully that makes clear my point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but about the two main points that you referred there, you referred to, for example, you gave the example of perhaps the piece of art transmitting something at the political level, and perhaps people would like it because it would be associated with a certain political stance or political message, and on the other hand, perhaps people liking some pieces of art just because if they are to like them and to tell other people that they like them and to be able to talk about those pieces of art, they would be signaling some of their qualities, some of their psychological qualities, like, for example, intelligence, right? So, about the political part, in evolutionary psychology, people also talk about in-group, out-group dynamics, and so and how people are groupish, and people like John Tooby have a lot of literature on coalitional psychology. So I guess that even on that side of things, evolutionary psychology would have something to say. And about the second part, I guess that we could reduce that, I guess, to conspicuous consumption and conspicuous signaling, because I mean basically that's what you're doing. You're saying, or you're transmitting to other people the information that you appreciate that type of art, and if people tend to associate that taste with something that has status in society, or with you being an intelligent person or something like that, it's the same when we buy any other type of product. For example, if we buy a luxury car, we're doing that probably not only because the car is beautiful, or that is because it has good intrinsic properties, but also because through buying it and through showing it outside to other people, we're signaling also that we have the resources and the monetary means to do so. So, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, well, just to clarify, I think signaling, you're right that like conspicuous consumption is a large part of it, but I think sometimes the signaling is of other things, like your knowledge of art history or creativity or your political values in group, out group. You mentioned some others, but so I do think signaling could be much more vast than just signaling wealth, and signaling. Then once it's that fast, you could think of whether or not it's pre-adapted, or whether or not it's a new form of signaling, a new trait that hasn't shown up in our evolutionary past. And I guess I need to think a little bit more carefully on which aspects of art could be explained by pre-adapted signals, and which aspects kind of require thinking about new things that you want to signal that we've never had to deal with signaling in the past. Obviously, either way, there's going to have to be some kind of evolved psychology of trying to signal or of showing off or things like that, presumably. So in that sense, I think Jeffrey Miller is fully right. I think it's just a question of how fine-tuned and pre-adapted the particular things being signaled are, and the particular things that we therefore find beautiful. And I think in many cases it's not going to be obvious, and it might be an open question. Do we find more rare pieces of art, originals instead of replicas, beautiful because of an evolved psychology of conspicuous consumption or an evolved psychology of rarity, or is that something that we learn as a novel contemporary adaptation? And I think that's a case where it's kind of hard to tell, and it could be either. But other cases might be harder to do to argue our pre-adaptations. Even when you allow for this kind of richer signaling space. So let me try with an example or two. But I should admit that this is fair, and like in some of these questions, it might be that a lot of it is just pre-programmed. But I don't know. So I like antique furniture, and I think I might have mentioned this in the thread too. But I like this kind of wooden furniture that has like little small squiggly lines in it that are created by worms over hundreds of years. And I highly doubt that cheesecake, because it really just looks like the furniture is cracked. I also kind of doubt, but maybe you can convince me otherwise, that this is my psychology of conspicuous consumption just got turned on. As like there's a pre-adaptation to conspicuously consuming, like a flip just got switched. Because my sense is, and again, I'm not 100% confident about this, the reason why I like this furniture is because I once had a fairly wealthy, classy friend who bought me furniture like this and told me this stuff is beautiful, this stuff isn't. And everybody else thought that everything she did was like, elegant and classy, and she knew what she was talking about. And I slowly just kind of like acquired that taste. And she happened to really like antique furniture. And so I kind of like developed that taste. And I don't think that at any moment I was like, okay, this furniture will help me show off. I don't even think that like I ever processed it as like conspicuous consumption. I think I just processed it as, what is beautiful? I don't know. This girl seems to know. I'm going to copy her. And so I think that there's kind of a more general psychology of of social limitation going on here that's not a specific pre-adaptation that has to do with like signaling of talent or of wealth or things like that. And so, again, I'm not 100% sure, but my sense is that this is coming from a general social learning process and not from a conspicuous consumption module or a men showing off creativity module. I think. And so my sense is that that's likely going on also with a lot of modern art, that you like pieces that you can explain well, that every time you explain well, people tell you, oh, that's really, really beautiful, or a good explanation, or your art teacher says are great. And I think that that's kind of a general module that goes on, which of course in the long run might pick up on things like conspicuous consumption or signaling of talent or creativity or things. But I think that the general psychology that's going on is more general than that, and will therefore allow you to kind of signal things that are more nuanced than pre-adaptation. So like these squiggly lines are not something that the worms create, are not something that we would have had in our evolutionary past, because it kind of requires wooden furniture that stays around for hundreds of years, which I think is probably a fairly new thing. And so we've kind of only culturally evolved to appreciate this kind of furniture. So that's my sense. My taste for antique furniture is something that couldn't have been a pre-adaptation, and I don't think it's just a spillover from an evolved psychology of conspicuous consumption. I think it's got to come from, you need a generalized learning module to get to this type of conspicuous consumption that requires this particular feature that's modern, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but perhaps that's just because I don't know if the discipline of evolutionary psychology in general is still lacking some cognitive mechanisms that aren't still discovered, or perhaps as people usually talk about they use the term modules of the mind, so perhaps there are some of them we haven't yet discovered. But for example, you talk a lot about social norms. So through game theory, we can explain perhaps how certain social norms spread throughout the human population, let's say. But I mean, isn't it the case that we could be attuned to look out for those sorts of cues from the environment, let's say in this case social cues, or not? And I mean, the way to explain why we are attuned to those sorts of things, like, for example, as I said, the prestige bias, the conformity bias, and other stuff like that, those things need evolutionary theory to explain why we have minds that look out for those sorts of information in our social environment and not others, or even why we even care about those things or not.
Yeah, so 100%, like this view of like these learning processes, conformity, prestige bias, reinforcement learning, they obviously, if they're true, to the extent they're true, they had to have evolved. And Joe Henrik and Rob Ward and this crowd put a lot of effort into showing that these are evolved learning processes that made evolutionary sense. And I think they're absolutely right about that. But I still think that's different from calling this evolutionary psychology. And the reason it's different is because the results of these evolved learning processes are new emergent phenomena, new types of adaptations that work differently than a more specialized module that doesn't allow for kind of a generalized ability to learn, in that they could allow for adaptations in a novel context based on contemporary information that wasn't around in our evolutionary past. And so that's the sense in which it's different, these emergent phenomena and the contemporary adaptations, and the sense in which it could be misleading to just to ignore the emergent properties of these learning processes and just focus on the evolved, more specialized modules. Is you might, for instance, be hyper-focused on aspects of art that signal things that showed up in our evolutionary past, like talent of the artist, or like conspicuous consumption. And you might be less prone to take into account the particular incentives that are very new, that weren't around in our past, like to show off that, say, for example, another example I mentioned in the thread is a lot of our aesthetics seem to be about like showing off that we no longer have to work in the fields, and we no longer that we have more access to like artisanal goods so I kind of mixed two examples there. Let me give you two examples that make this clear. So one is like in an agricultural society where like some people are wealthy enough to like get out of the fields and to be able to like work indoors, like that's they might have ways to signal that they don't work in the field, like having long fingernails or lighter skin. Those are things that I think wouldn't have shown up in our evolutionary past. So that's a sense of our aesthetics that like doesn't just come out of a strict view of like a pre-adaptation. You kind of have to think of an emergent property of a novel type of incentive to show that you don't work in the field. That's the new incentive. And so that's something that I think you would miss if you just think about evolutionary psychology. Okay. Likewise, post-industrial revolution, we had these artisanal goods, like ways of showing that like you have jewelry that was handmade, or that you have chocolate or wine that was like made by yourself or your friends if you're a hipster. And these are things that like you would want to signal in our society. So it might, in a contemporary environment where like you have to deal with like showing that things aren't mass produced. Showing something's not mass produced is not something we had to do in the past. It's not something we evolved like a capability of doing. We had to kind of like figure out that's something important to do, and that I think you can only do not with a specialized module, but with more a generalized like social learning module, like the kind of Board and Henrik talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but let me just tell you this, because I think you are too focused on the idea that perhaps evolutionary psychologists try to explain all of human behavior on the basis of adaptations. That is, that you think that perhaps it is adaptations all the way down in evolutionary psychology. But there are certain things, and even major ones, like, for example, religion, that is explained through evolutionary theory, not as an adaptation, even though in all studied societies people have some sort of religion or another. They don't say that it's an adaptation, but that it is rather a byproduct of several different adaptations. So, for example, through the work of Pascal Boyer, Scott Atran, Robert Macaulay, and others in the cognitive science of religion, they talk about how religion is the product of several different adaptations, like, for example, a theory of mind, or as it was previously known, folk psychology, and also folk physics, that is, how we are innately predisposed to interact with the world around us and to deal with solid objects and things like that, and the properties of our world, let's say. Also, folk biology, that is the ways we think about other animated entities, other living biological entities, and then also things like, for example, the hyperactive agency detection device. That is, if we see something happening in the world, we tend to attribute an agent to it. We tend to think that someone or something caused that thing to happen. And also promiscuous teleology, that is to say that we tend to think that things follow a certain path, a certain unidirectional path when developing and evolving and things like that. So, and also other adaptations and other modules they talk about. But this was just to give you a few examples. But I mean, they gather all of these different adaptations, and they studied religion on that basis, as different aspects of religion being the byproduct of those mental adaptations that we've evolved to deal with other evolutionarily relevant problems.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that that's another good example, and I think this might help illustrate some of the other points that maybe were harder to illustrate with aesthetics. So I'm glad you brought it up, even though it wasn't in that original thread. So for starters, I guess I should say I think there is a lot of insight in this psychological or cultural literature story to religion. There's clearly a lot of aspects of religion that are byproducts of our evolved psychology, like agency detection, and I think that's insightful and valuable work that picks out and documents these effects. However, I think that this work also exemplifies one of my earlier points that I was making, which is that evolutionary psychologists have a tendency to see things as either functional, either pre-adapted, evolved, something that was functional in our EA and by chance still is, or something that's a byproduct, and missing out that you can get a lot of functional stuff that are only functional with respect to our current contemporary incentive structure. And I think a lot of religion fits the latter, and there's a lot of stuff that Boyer and colleagues missed as a result of that. Okay, which again isn't to say that they weren't picking up on real insights with the examples that you gave. I just think that those examples miss out on a lot of the meat. So what do I mean by a lot of the meat? I think, and maybe you can prove me wrong on this or send me some references otherwise, but I think a lot of the stuff that they're picking up on are cases in which we're looking at the content of religious beliefs that's what I would call not payoff relevant. So, whether I believe that God has, looks kind of like a human agent or doesn't in my image of God is not a particularly payoff relevant feature of religion. It's an interesting feature of our psychology that I imagine him as an old white dude with a big beard. It's interesting that that's how I imagine God, but I don't think that that's like the most I guess historically or practically important feature of religion that's like begging for an explanation. And those features are the features that I think of it as payoff relevant. Things like, why does religion cause you to be more likely to cooperate with in-group members by hate on out-group members? Why does religion cause you to like follow a bunch of like useless, silly rules? Maybe why do theological disputes have the certain features that they have, or people are willing to die for them, or things like that? And so I think of those as like more payoff relevant, and hence maybe more. Well, that's what I find more interesting is like why we fought wars over religion, why religion causes us to like be nice to fellow religious people and hate on others, and the exact features of how I imagine God is like. Maybe will teach us something interesting about like cognition, but isn't a fundamental open question about religion. And I think that the branch of research that Boyer et al. Are good at is those features that God is likely to have, but it says less about these kind of more, I think, materially relevant, payoff relevant features of religion, which I find both more puzzling as well as their approach has less to say about. And I think to answer those things, you need to think about other things like cultural evolutionary process and contemporary incentives. And because Boyer are focused on pre-adaptations and byproducts, they kind of miss all that junk. And again, I think what they're saying is right. It's just missing a lot of this really, really important stuff. And the payoff relevant stuff is what I tend to focus on in my own research. So I might ask questions like the ones I listed to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. But now, and since you talked about payoffs and costs, let me just give you another example. This has nothing to do with aesthetics nor religion or anything like that. But since we're talking about social norms, and in your thread you also refer to morality, Recently, I've had on the show Dr. Alexander Rosenberg, and he has written a very interesting book, How History Gets Things Wrong, and there he gives a very interesting example about how foot binding developed in ancient China and then spread as a social norm throughout the entire population. It started on the elites and then it trickled down through the rest of the population, and then eventually they simply stopped doing that. They stopped that practice, that tradition, let's say. And he starts off by this. So we have, from an evolutionary perspective, men have paternity uncertainty. That is, they can't be 100% sure that the child that was born from the woman they are with is, right? They can't be sure of that. Only the women can be sure. So he starts off with that, and then he says that in the specific circumstances of China, I don't know, perhaps because they had access to certain types of materials, or because the way in their specific environment they evolved certain types of technologies or things like that, they decided to start foot binding the women because that would render it much more difficult for them to betray their husbands, and that is for them to prevent infidelity on the part of the women. And then since it started as something associated with the elite and with status, eventually no one would be able to marry one of their daughters if she was not foot binded or something like that. So this practice spread throughout Chinese society, but eventually, because it reached the point of saturation where everyone was doing it, and that would no longer distinguish some women from other women, let's say, eventually, I think it was in the 20th century, someone with a lot of status even decided to not foot bind their daughters, and since no one was really able already to distinguish themselves from other people because virtually all women were foot binded, then eventually they discontinued that type of practice. So I mean, but I'm picking up on this example not only because in part he explains it through evolutionary game theory, but he starts off from evolutionary theory with the part of men having paternity uncertainty, and that would be at the basis of that type of behavior.
Yeah, I guess I haven't seen this paper, but I guess I would say, like, yes, and anytime you're gonna model kind of cultural evolutionary processes or learning processes, and including when you incorporate game theory, it's going to be based on either a notion of incentives that is biologically ingrained, or something that is biasing the learning processes that's biologically ingrained, and that's definitely going to incorporate information from our evolutionary past, as well as more or less, and depending on the context, and it may be more in some cases than other cases, more or less specialized, modules. And so I agree that in this case, it sounds like the game theory model really needed to take into account certain features of our biological past, like the differences between males and females when it comes to paternity and maternity certainty. And I think that's generally true, that any model that I write down, you're going to kind of have to make certain assumptions our preferences based on what makes evolutionary sense. Any notion of incentives or any notion of a learning process will have to take into account some basic evolutionary facts. I think that's right. And it would be a pretty bad model if it wasn't grounded in evolutionary reasoning, because these things clearly evolved. Yeah, I think the real question is just, can you stop after you've done that biological evolutionary reasoning, or do you also need to then do additional research or modeling about the contemporary incentives or cultural evolution or reinforcement learning process? And my claim would be that in some contexts it's enough to stop after the evolutionary, after modeling the biological evolutionary process, but in other cases you need to do more than that. That's the claim.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what if we were to put it this way? So we would explain the basis or the origins of certain behaviors through evolutionary theory, and then to explain the precise behaviors that people adopt in a certain society, we would have to add the part coming from cultural and social evolution, and perhaps how people accumulate certain technologies and behaviors over time through cultural evolution and cumulative culture and things like that. And when we have a society that works under certain socio-cultural norms, then we have to go back to our innate psychology to explain how those sorts of cues from the environment are processed by our minds.
Yeah, I think that might suffice for some of the things we've been talking about. Like maybe for a lot of the aesthetics examples I gave, that's all you need. I think, and maybe it's worth us talking through, that will do less well when we talk about religion or politics or morality. In those cases, I think it's not just that you're filling in some of the details with knowledge of the particular culture. I think you're getting totally new phenomena out of the cultural learning processes. So the idea of like in-group cooperation and out-group hate, and what counts as an in-group member, and what theology ends up developing to support that. I think is a lot more than just the details of the cultural environment that you're filling in. I think that's a totally emergent phenomena that you don't get unless you have cultural evolution. And I think likewise with like politics, if you want to understand like political ideologies, you really can't just think about an involved psychology of like coalition formation and then side taking. I think you really need to take into account to get any sense of the types of political principles people espouse, the way they. I think that really requires emergent properties of the political institutions that we have. So maybe it's worth. I don't know if we have time today, but maybe it's worth unpacking some of those cases where, unlike aesthetics, I think you're getting more emergent properties of the cultural evolution than just filling in some of the contextual details.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, I think that in this case, what I don't understand is perhaps what you mean by emergent properties, because I mean they have to be biologically based, because we wouldn't be able to process information that our brains are not able to deal with. So what could you please clarify a bit more what you mean by emergent properties there?
Yeah. So let me try. So one of the things that I mean is the difference between what's an equilibria with respect to our current incentive structure and an equilibria with respect to what would have been an equilibria in the EEA in our evolutionary past. That difference, I think, is kind of fundamental, and the things that are equilibria only in our contemporary environment, you can't get to those things, those equilibria, unless you have a process that does real-time adjustments within, a current contemporary environment. And so that the idea that you get to contemporary functionality, the idea that you can get to functional behavior in the contemporary environment, I think you can only get if you have a generalized, if you have a process that dynamically updates and achieves functionality in real time. And that's faster than biological evolution, something like cultural evolution or reinforcement learning. And so the result that we behave functionally in our contemporary environment, if that contemporary environment is not the same as anything we've experienced in our evolutionary past, then that result, that we're functional for our current environment, is an emergent phenomena of these dynamic adjustment processes, like cultural evolution or reinforcement learning. That would be one example of an emergent phenomenon. And by emergent phenomena, I mean it doesn't just maybe I don't have a good definition of an emergent phenomenon. I think all I mean by it is it's something that comes out of these adjustment processes that, like, you don't really need to think so much about what caused these adjustment processes to get off the ground. These processes do a lot of work on their own, and if you don't think about these processes, you kind of miss that insight, and it would be kind of hard to model that insight on its own. Maybe it's, I guess I don't have a good definition of emergent property, but it seems like that's one emergent property, is that contemporary functionality, that thinking about specialized modules wouldn't give you that, and you don't really need to think so much about, just like in order to understand biological evolution, you don't need to think so much about physics or the biochemistry. Same thing here. To understanding that you can get contemporary functionality, you don't really need to think about what got cultural evolution off the ground. You just kind of need to realize one property of cultural evolution is it finds contemporary functionality. Maybe that's all I mean by emergent phenomena. And there's only one example of an emergent phenomena, the one that I focus on in my work, because I focus on incentives and game theory. But I think Joe, Henrik, and Rob Boyd will talk about several others, like the importance of cultural group selection, which very much require cultural evolution to get off the ground, and have a similar feature that you don't really get them straight out of unevolved psychology. You kind of need this new dynamic process to get that off the ground. And to get that off the ground, you don't really need to think about what led to the dynamic process so much. You kind of just need to think about cultural evolution as a new thing. And so that's kind of what I mean by it. And I think the analogy to, like, do you need to know biochemistry to understand biological evolution, or do you need to know physics to understand biological evolution? No, not really. Most of biological evolution, you can ignore that stuff before, and it's not enough to think about just physics to understand evolution. Because a lot of what evolution does is kind of an emergent phenomena of natural selection. And so I think the same thing here. There are emergent phenomena, there are properties of human psychology that come out of cultural evolution or that come out of reinforcement learning that don't really require you thinking about biological evolution, and that you'll miss if you don't think about this phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just before we go, let me just give you another example. One I talked about with David Buss and Sarah Hill. Sarah Hill does a lot of work in life history theory, which is very interesting. But anyway, at a certain point in their interviews, I asked them if perhaps, for example, if since nowadays we have the internet and online pornography, if men are exposed to that, perhaps that environmental cue would tweak their mating systems to prefer short-term strategies, because I mean subconsciously their cognitive mechanisms associated with mating would process that information as if there were a lot of beautiful and available women all the time to mate with them, and I asked them if that perhaps would be a novel strategy that wasn't really available for us in our environment of evolutionary adaptedness, because we really didn't have as many women available to mate, and women signaling to us that they would be available to mate with us during most of our evolutionary history. And I mean, I guess that would be what you mean by an emergent property. In this case, that perhaps men would prefer more a short-term mating strategy than they would during most of our history, because we didn't got that environmental cue. But in this case, they say that it is not exactly a novel strategy, but it is something that our innate cognition would produce if and when we were exposed to that kind of information, even though we weren't really exposed to it throughout most of our history. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. That if your prediction turns out to be true, I'm not sure if it's true, but if it turns out to be true that we're more into short-term mates after being exposed to internet pornography, then I think an easy explanation for that would be a life history story explanation, which is just that if you see a lot of willing women, then you should realize that they're readily available, and so you should adjust your strategy. And I would call that, again, using my language from earlier, pre-adaptation, in that we just have a switch and that switch itself evolved, which is like long-term versus short-term mating strategy. Well, it depends how readily available women are. And that switch gets turned on by the easy access to pornography. And I don't think that requires any notion of cultural evolution or any emergent property of our learning processes to comprehend. And I think that's a good contrasting case, because that's a case where there is some notion of learning or some notion of cultural input, but I think it's very, very different from the cases I'm describing. And I think it's the case that evolutionary psychologists tend to turn to, and they often use it to say, to give lip service to their tending to culture or to environmental inputs. I just think that's kind of one side in which culture has an input, namely it adjusts switches on evolved modules. But I think that's actually that does well in some contexts, like mating psychology, but is missing out on a lot of other stuff. And so I really want to contrast that with when I was talking about religion and morality and politics. I think those are really hard to explain using the same kind of story where there's just a switch that gets flipped on. And so when I refer to cultural evolution and emergent properties, I very much mean not those cases. Those are cases that I think evolutionary psychology deals with fine, but I think that they're different, and I think it's kind of unfair and a sleight of hand for evolutionary psychologists to mention those cases and claim that they're therefore recognizing cultural evolution, because I think that's just kind of like a tiny fraction of what culture is doing and not the
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Hoffman, we've already covered a lot of ground today. What would you say about us finishing the interview at this point, and perhaps another time in the future having another conversation, perhaps also to talk about, as I told you before the interview started, about your threads on methodology in psychology and perhaps some methodological flaws that people have in psychology, and also about your great thread on moral realism?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah,
okay.
Good questions, and thanks for having me.
Okay. Oh, by the way, just before we go, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet for them to get in touch with your work?
I'm fairly active on Twitter, and then if you Google my name, you'll find my website with some recent working papers and stuff like that.
Okay. So again, thank you a lot for taking the time. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for your questions. They were very engaging.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel in February 2018, and so I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and I would really like to ask you just to consider visiting my Patreon page and making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. And so otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Elga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda and Brian Rivera. Thank you for all.